In this video, I'm starting a series on the feeding of the 5,000. This is a sub-series within my larger series on gospel reliability and miracle accounts in the Gospels. It would not be too great of an exaggeration to say that the feeding of the 5,000 is the second best attested miracle in the Gospels, second only to the resurrection of Jesus. In no small part, the special status that the feeding of the 5,000 has arises from the fact that it's told in all four Gospels. This is unusual because usually the Gospel of John likes to tell stories that are not found in the other three Gospels. So there's not a lot of overlap, particularly in miracle stories, between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke. On the other hand, this is told in all four. And in fact, as we'll see in later videos, we have a specific fact that's actually quite an important fact that's found in Luke alone. So Luke appears to be getting that information from someplace other than Mark. Sometimes scholars will say that when a story is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we assume that Matthew and Luke both got it from Mark, but that can't be the case with this particular detail. So this is a very important miracle in that sense of being unusually well attested. It's also important in that it contributes itself quite a lot to the case for gospel reliability. Of course, we've got other evidence for gospel reliability, and when we try to evaluate the feeding of the 5,000, we need to bring all of that together. But it has got a lot of momentum itself coming from those accounts and the interconnections between them to confirm gospel reliability in itself. This is especially true for undesigned coincidences, which is an argument that, of course, I talk about in a lot of places. Some of the iconic undesigned coincidences that I like to use to illustrate it, the concept, come from the feeding of the 5,000. And in fact, there are more undesigned coincidences for the feeding of the 5,000 than for any other incident in the New Testament. And this, again, is because we have these four different accounts. And it's nice to note here, too, that undesigned coincidences don't tend to preferentially clump around just non-miraculous occurrences or just miraculous occurrences. They have that nice sort of scatter pattern that you would expect if both the miracles and the non-miracles are coming from eyewitnesses. So that's just a cool little note to bear in mind. At this point, we want to talk about the question of independence. For that reason, though it might seem a little surprising, I'm going to begin my series on the credibility of the accounts for the feeding of the 5,000 by talking about alleged discrepancies. So that might seem like a strange place to start. But apparent discrepancies, and even for that matter, real discrepancies, can disconfirm some theories that are especially popular concerning the Gospels. A lot of times, if you find the same story in multiple Gospels, scholars will immediately start looking to especially literary theories of dependence. I've already mentioned one of these, that Matthew and Luke got it from Mark, and then maybe they kind of embellished from their imaginations from then on or something like that, but that they had Mark in front of them and used Mark as their only actual factual source rather than having other factual access to what really happened. Another type of dependence theory that you see a lot of is an oral tradition theory, where the story is being told over and over again within the Christian community, and then different people just kind of go their separate ways, but they're basing it upon this very familiar story that they had heard told many times. I would say that apparent discrepancies, and again, even if there are real discrepancies, tend to disconfirm these sorts of dependence hypotheses. Because if the authors knew a story on which they were basing it, and they had no other access to what really happened, there's no reason for them to contradict each other, or especially that first source. For example, to contradict Mark. If Mark is available, why contradict Mark? If you're even going to make stuff up, why not just make stuff up that goes beyond Mark or goes in a different direction or something, but that is at least compatible with what you find in Mark, because you can check that. And so there's no reason to be contradicting. So contradictions are actually very fruitful, and all the more so if we can understand them plausibly as the result of variations in testimony and the kinds of circumstances that arise when we have different people who actually have different access to the event, but are just telling it in their own way. In fact, even small errors can arise in that way, but that's because the person is remembering something. And that may be incompatible, and I would say it is incompatible with a theory of inerrancy, but we're examining these from a historical point of view. However, with all of the alleged discrepancies I'm going to talk about, I'm going to give what I think are not implausible ways of harmonizing them so that they need not be real discrepancies, but nonetheless they serve that function of showing independence, because there's no reason even to have an apparent discrepancy between your account and a well-known account if you're just copying it. On the other hand, if you're giving your own version, then you give your own version from what you know you have confidence to believe is the way it really happened. So let's get started with one of those. I'm just going to do one in this video, and then I'll talk about a couple more of these apparent discrepancies in the next video. The one I'm going to talk about here concerns the question of where and when Jesus first saw the crowd that he eventually fed. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that the disciples had been on a preaching ministry, and they came back to tell Jesus about what had happened and about their success and how things had gone, and things were really busy where they were. We'll talk about the reasons for that later. I think it was a combination of events going on around them and of Jesus' popularity, which we're very familiar with. It said they didn't even have leisure to eat. So Jesus says, let's go away by ourselves. They get into a boat to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But the people see them and follow them. They follow them on foot. In fact, it says they run. Okay, now this actually is in some ways confirmed by what we know about the size of the Sea of Galilee, because you might think, oh, come on, he's going all the way to the other side of the lake. How are they going to run around to the other side? Of course, people are used to going on foot at that time. They don't think as much of it as we do. But if we examine it, we find that the Sea of Galilee is only about 7 miles wide at its longest point. Its widest point, and they wouldn't even have been crossing it here at its widest point. So to get just over that little sliver over to the other side, it wouldn't be that big of a deal, especially if the people were highly motivated. They may even have been able to see Jesus out of the water. Hey, look, he's there. We're going to get him. So they come around and they meet him when he gets out of the boat. And it says when he got out of the boat, he saw the multitude, and he had compassion on them because they were as sheep without a shepherd. Go to the Gospel of John. John doesn't tell about that preaching ministry. He doesn't tell about how the disciples were coming and trying to report to Jesus. And he doesn't even tell about Jesus saying to them, let's go someplace by ourselves. But it says that he did go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, and he gives it also its other name, the Sea of Tiberias. He shows a knowledge of those two names. And then it says that he went up onto a mountain with his disciples, and he lifted up his eyes and he saw the crowd coming toward him, the great crowd. And it already mentioned the great crowd, just very briefly, that the great crowd of people were following him. But if you just read John, you would get the impression, understandably, that he managed to escape them temporarily and to go up to the mountainside with his disciples, and it was only then that he saw the crowd. All of the Gospels agree that there was a mountain in this region. They all mention the mountain at various points in the account. But John mentions it here right at the beginning. He's up the mountainside and he sees the crowd coming toward him. He turns to Philip and he says, where can we buy bread that these may eat? That's going to feature in a later undesigned coincidence. But there is this apparent discrepancy, because if you just read Mark, you would think that he first saw them when he got out of the boat, because they followed him right there and they're like, surprise, it's us. And in John, you would get the impression that he first sees them up on the mountainside, and he can't first see them in both places. A seaside is not a mountainside. Okay, but when we read the larger context in the Synoptic Gospels, I think we can understand how these are different witness perspectives on the same series of events. In Mark, it says that when Jesus had compassion on them, he taught them many things. In Matthew, it says that he cured them, he healed them. In Luke, it mentions both, that he taught them and he healed them. So we're to picture them being with him for quite some time. In fact, in the Synoptics, it says that when the day was getting on, then the disciples come to him and they say, send the people away so they can go and get food. They become concerned and they start having this conversation about where the people are going to get food. John doesn't mention that earlier part of the day. But when you take the Synoptics more seriously, you can see how this all kind of fits together. Because what you have is something more like a conference than a concert. It's not like Jesus is there, they see him, and right away he's like, hey, let's feed the people immediately. They've been with him off and on all day. He's moving in and out amongst the crowds. He's teaching, he's healing. And so then as the day gets on, he slips away temporarily up the mountain with his disciples. And as you know can happen in this kind of situation, when you have a sort of celebrity, the people are always kind of on the lookout, right? And when they catch sight of him, hey, there's the master. And they converge on him once more. He's up the mountainside and he sees them coming toward him, and he's, talking to his disciples, and he says, well, where should we buy bread that these may eat? The disciples may have already introduced the topic, as in the Synoptics, send the people away. And then he actually sees, large numbers of people coming towards, well, what are we going to do now, Philip? Where should we buy bread that these may eat? So it fits together, but John wants to get to the healing immediately. That's John's emphasis. So he doesn't talk about the healing and the preaching that took place earlier in the day. He moves more directly to the feeding and to Jesus asking where they can buy bread for those people to eat. So this is a very fruitful, apparent discrepancy because it shows the independence of the accounts, and yet at the same time it's explicable in terms that are very plausible of different witnesses who are just telling about the events from their own perspectives. So we're going to continue with 2 more apparent discrepancies in our next video. I'm Lydia McGrew. Thanks for watching.